On August 23, 1942, at 16:18 hours, the first wave of Luftflotte 4 bombers crossed the Volga River and began the systematic destruction of the city of Stalingrad. The smell of burning oil from the storage tanks at the river's edge carried for 40 kilometers, the sound of 600 aircraft engines layered over the screaming of the Stuka sirens. Ash fell on the Volga ferries carrying women and children eastward across the water. The story most viewers have inherited about what followed runs along a single rail. The Wehrmacht, drawn into the city by its symbolic name, was always doomed there. The battle of wills was inevitable. The tide turned. One sentence in a textbook. The archival record tells a different and far more specific story. Operation Blue, Fall Blau, was launched on June 28, 1942, with 1.3 million Axis troops, 1,900 tanks and 1,600 aircraft along a single axis. The original objective was the Caucasus oil fields. Stalingrad was a flank guard. On July 23, 1942, Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 45, which split Army Group South into 2 diverging axes against the explicit warning of his Chief of the General Staff. The city became the target only after the strategic plan had already fractured. On August 23, 6th Army's 14th Panzer Corps reached the Volga north of Stalingrad. Civilian deaths in the first 24 hours of bombing exceeded 1,000. On September 13th, Friedrich Paulus ordered the first ground assault into the city center. On September 14th, the 13th Guards Rifle Division under General Alexander Rodimtsev crossed the Volga at night under fire, taking 30% casualties before reaching the western bank. On October 14th, 3 German infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions were thrown against the tractor factory, where Soviet workers were still welding T-34 hulls 200 meters from the front line. And then, on the night of November 22, 1942, 6 hours after the Soviet pincers had already closed behind 6th Army at Kalach, Hitler signed an order at his headquarters at Vinica. The order forbade breakout. Its carbon copy survived in Bundesarchiv file RH-20-6, and historians would not fully read it in operational context until the OKW files were reordered in the 1990s. Fall Blau, the offensive that was never supposed to end at Stalingrad. On June 28, 1942, the Wehrmacht launched the largest offensive of its war in the east against a country that only 7 months earlier it had nearly destroyed. The plan was named Fall Blau. The objective was not a city. The objective was oil, the Caucasus fields at Maykop, Grozny and Baku, on which the Reich's mechanized capacity depended after the strategic loss of the previous winter at Moscow. 1.3 million men, 1,900 tanks, 1,600 aircraft, a single advancing axis along the Don Bend toward the south-southeast. The original Führer Directive that authorized the offensive, Directive No. 41, signed on April 5, 1942, described Stalingrad only as a secondary objective, a city to be neutralized as a flank, not seized as a prize. The directive is preserved in the OKH records of the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv. It says what it says, then came the fracture. On July 23, 1942, with the offensive less than a month old and the Wehrmacht already deeper into the Don steppe than any planner had believed possible, Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 45 at his forward headquarters at Vinica in occupied Ukraine. The directive split Army Group South into 2 new commands. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, was ordered south into the Caucasus. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs, was ordered east toward the Volga and the city of Stalingrad. 2 diverging axes, 600 kilometers apart by mid-August, sharing the same fuel reserves, sharing the same overstretched rail network, sharing the same insufficient air cover. The Chief of the General Staff of the Army, Colonel General Franz Halder, recorded his protest in his war diary the same night. The entry survives in the Bundesarchiv RH-2 series. Halder wrote that the directive treated the enemy as already defeated. He wrote that the simultaneous pursuit of 2 strategic objectives with 1 set of forces would consume the operational reserves of the entire offensive. He was correct. Within 8 days, the 4th Panzer Army was reassigned twice, first detached southward toward the Caucasus axis, then recalled eastward toward the Stalingrad axis, burning fuel reserves it could not replace and arriving at neither destination on schedule. The encirclement of Stalingrad was delayed by 3 weeks. Halder was dismissed from his post on September 24th. Paulus at Nuremberg would describe Directive Number 45 in his interrogation transcripts as the moment the offensive lost its operational center. This is the part the post-war memory cannot easily process. The defining battle of the Eastern Front was not chosen. It was inherited. It was not the result of Hitler's fixation on a name on a map. That came later. It was the consequence of a single signed directive whose contents have been in the public archive since 1946, available for any researcher to read. The textbook version compressed it into a sentence. The directive itself is 16 pages long, and that fracture by August had a name on a map. August 23rd, the day the city died and the battle began. Vasily Chuikov was 42 years old. He was short, thick-set, profane, and had been a Soviet military attaché in China. He arrived in Stalingrad on September 12, 1942, believing the city had perhaps days left. By that date, the city he was inheriting had already been broken open. On August 23, 1942, beginning at approximately 16:18 hours, Luftflotte 4 under General Wolfram von Richthofen flew approximately 1,000 sorties against Stalingrad in a single day. It was the heaviest single-day bombing of any city on the Eastern Front to that point. The wooden housing districts on the city's periphery caught and the fires merged. The oil storage tanks at the riverside ignited and burned through the night. Soviet civil defense reports preserved in the regional archive give a casualty range between 25,000 and 40,000 in the first 48 hours. The number is approximate because the agency that produced it was itself partially destroyed. The Volga ferries, Stalingrad's only resupply line, since the Germans held the entire western steppe, ran at night under artillery fire and air attack. The 13th Guards Rifle Division, 10,000 men under General Alexander Rodimtsev, crossed in the night of September 14th, with German positions already on the riverbank above them. Rodimtsev's after-action report, held at RGVA in Moscow, lists the unit at 30% casualties before they reached the western bank. They reached it. They held a 1-kilometer strip the bridgehead held. Then came Chuikov. The 62nd Army he assumed command of was no longer an army in the operational sense. It was a list of fragments, dug into cellars and ruined floors, stretched along a frontage that in places was less than 100 meters deep between the Germans and the river. Chuikov's order, issued on the day he took command, was specific. The lines would close to within 30 meters of German positions. The forward defenders would hug the enemy. They would press so close that the Luftwaffe could not bomb them without bombing the German infantry. Richthofen's air supremacy, total, unchallenged, the most decisive instrument the Wehrmacht possessed at that point in the war, would be neutralized by geometry. The doctrine entered Soviet operational vocabulary as blizhny boy, close combat. Chuikov's memoir, The Beginning of the Road, published in the 1960s, describes the order in plain language. The corresponding 62nd Army War Diary, held at RGVA, records the operational signal that disseminated it down to regimental level on September 12th. From that day, the battle changed shape. It was no longer a battle of maneuver. It was no longer a battle the German army had been trained for. The 6th Army staff officers, reading their daily situation reports through late September, still believed they were perhaps a week from completing the city's clearance. The maps in their headquarters at Golubinsky on the Don showed the Soviet bridgehead as a thin rectangle, easily reduced. They were not wrong about the rectangle. They were wrong about how long it would take to enter it. The captured German operational records list 9 separate divisional strength assaults on the central city between September 14th and October 13th. Each one ground a few hundred meters forward and stopped. The casualty rate among the assault battalions exceeded 50% in some sectors. The replacements, when they arrived, were younger and less trained. By the first week of October, the 6th Army was no longer the formation that had crossed the Don in July, and on October 14th, every available rifle in 6th Army was thrown into one factory district. Rattenkrieg, War of Rats inside the factories of the Volga. In the autumn of 1942, inside 3 factories on the western bank of the Volga, the war stopped resembling any war that had been fought before. The tractor factory, the Barricadi ordnance plant, the Red October steelworks, 3 industrial complexes strung along the riverfront in the city's northern districts, each covering several square kilometers of foundries, machine halls, rail spurs, and reinforced concrete. On October 14, 1942, at first light, the largest German assault of the entire battle began. 3 infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions. The 14th, 24th, and 16th Panzer, the 305th and 389th Infantry, on a frontage of approximately 5 kilometers. The 6th Army War Diary, Bundesarchiv RH 20-6, records the assault opening with the heaviest artillery preparation the army had used inside the city. The tractor factory was the primary objective. By the end of the first day, German forward elements were inside the workshops. By November 1st, the factory was in German hands. The 6th Army's own returns list 13,000 casualties in 17 days for that sector alone. Inside the workshops, the fighting did not resemble combat as it appeared in any pre-war German manual. The German infantry called it Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, floor by floor, stairwell by stairwell. The same building changing hands 2 and 3 times in a single day. A doorway captured at 900 hours, lost at 1300, retaken at dusk, abandoned by midnight. The Soviet defenders were 62nd Army troops mixed with workers' militia drawn from the factories themselves. The Stalingrad photographs of the Soviet correspondent Georgy Zelmer, held in the Russian State Documentary Film and Photo Archive, show welders in goggles inside the same workshops where the German assault parties were operating. Some of the T-34 hulls assembled in October 1942 rolled directly off the floor and into combat without painting, without markings. South of the factory district, on a small square on the line of 9 January Street, 4 stories of shell-pocked apartment building came to be known by the name of one of its defenders. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov of the 13th Guards held the building for 58 days with a garrison that, in the documentary record, varied between 24 and 30 men. They held it against repeated battalion-strength assaults. The building still stands. The plaque on its wall lists names. To the west, on Mamayev Kurgan, Hill 102.0 in the German maps, the soil was so churned by shell fire that survivors recorded the snow that fell in November turned dark within the hour. The hill changed hands 14 times during the battle. A Red Army sniper named Vasily Zaitsev of the 1047th Rifle Regiment kept a tally in his unit's records. Soviet wartime accounts placed his confirmed total at 225 by mid-December. Specialist research in the post-1991 archives has compressed and refined the figure but not erased it. Zaitsev's combat report and the regimental returns are both held at Samo. Inside 6th Army, the daily ammunition expenditure began to outrun the rail capacity of the supply line behind the Don. By November 5th, divisional commanders were rationing artillery rounds. By November 11th, the final German push reached the Volga in 3 places. They could not hold continuous frontage between them. The army was no longer an army advancing through a city. It was a constellation of strong points in a city that was burning around them, with the Volga on one side and an open steppe on the other, and the steppe held by Romanian and Italian formations whose equipment scales the Wehrmacht's own staff officers privately described as inadequate. The German correspondent Feldpost letters, held in Soviet captured mail collections, repeat one phrase in different handwriting through October and November. Nothing here is what we were told. And the question, on the Soviet side, was no longer whether to counterattack, but where the line would break. Operation Uranus and the order Hitler signed at Vinica. On November 19, 1942, at 7:20 hours, 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire on the Romanian 3rd Army positions north of the Don Bend. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Operation Uranus had been planned in secret since mid-September by the Stavka chiefs Alexander Vasilevsky and Georgy Zhukov. The encirclement force totaled approximately 1.1 million troops in 3 fronts. The point of attack was not the city. The point of attack was the flanks. The Romanian Third Army to the north and the Romanian Fourth Army to the south held those flanks because the German formations that had begun the offensive had been consumed inside the city. By the second day of the operation, the Romanian Third Army had ceased to exist as a coherent formation. By the fourth day, at approximately 1400 hours on November 23rd, Soviet armoured spearheads from the two pincers met at Kalak-on-Don, west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, the Romanian Sixth Corps, parts of the 4th Panzer Army, approximately 290,000 personnel by the most cited German staff estimate, were inside a pocket, the Kessel, the cauldron. On the night of November 22nd, 6 hours before the pincers closed, Hitler had signed an order at Vinica. Sixth Army would not break out. It would hold its position. It would be supplied by air. The carbon copy of that order is preserved in Bundesarchiv RH 20-6. The Luftwaffe High Command, through Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring and Chief of Staff Hans Jeschonek, had committed to a daily airlift of 500 tons. The actual delivered average across the 72 days of the airlift, according to Luftflotte 4's own logistics records, was 94 tons, less than a fifth of the requirement. The shortfall was measured in calories, in ammunition rounds, in fuel for the remaining vehicles, in medical supplies that were not delivered to the field hospitals around Gumrak and Pitomnik. By mid-December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group Don launched Operation Winterstorm, a relief drive northeastward toward the pocket from Kotelnikovo. The 6th Panzer Division, the 23rd Panzer, the 17th Panzer. By December 23rd, the lead elements had reached the Mishkova River, 48 kilometers from the pocket's southwestern edge. They could not advance further. The Soviet counterstroke, Operation Little Saturn, was striking the Italian 8th Army on the Don, threatening Manstein's own rear. The relief halted. The pocket was not relieved. Inside it, through January 1943, the situation passed beyond what unit returns alone could measure. Medical officer reports from the surviving field hospitals, captured at the surrender and now held at the Bundesarchiv, document frostbite cases at division level in tens of thousands. Caloric intake for the line infantry by mid-January is recorded in some divisions at under 800 a day. Starvation, frostbite, and the cold became the primary killers. Operation Ring, the final Soviet reduction of the pocket under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, opened on January 10, 1943. By January 31st, Soviet troops were inside the Univermag department store on Red Square in central Stalingrad, where Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal the night before, had moved his headquarters. At 7:35 hours on February 2nd, 1943, the surrender was signaled. 91,000 prisoners were taken in the final intake. Approximately 6,000 of them returned to Germany alive. The rest did not survive captivity. The story the West received for the next half-century came primarily through Manstein's post-war memoir Verloren Siege, through the airlift testimony of Luftwaffe officers in US and British custody, through the operational summaries published in the official histories. The Soviet archival side, the TSAMO operational records, the RGVA Stavka directives, the NKVD interrogation transcripts of Paulus himself, was not destroyed. It was inaccessible. The Cold War alliance had political reasons on both sides to leave 290,000 men, 6 months, 4 armies, and the documented record of a signed directive reduced to a single sentence in a textbook. The tide turned at Stalingrad. The archive was always there. The retelling shrank. And Paulus walked out of the Univermag basement under guard in his greatcoat into the snow, and the recording of his interrogation, which would sit in a Moscow archive for 48 years, began that afternoon. The files that opened in 1991 and the names that came back. In the spring of 1943, in a wooden building outside Moscow, a Soviet historian named Isaac Mintz began recording interviews with the men who had just survived the battle. The project was called the Mintz Commission. It was funded under wartime priority. The historians traveled to forward positions, to hospital wards, to rear area rest battalions with stenographers and notebooks. They interviewed 62nd Army survivors of the factories. They interviewed Rodimtsev's officers from the 13th Guards. They interviewed civilians who had been evacuated across the Volga in August 1942 and returned in February 1943 to a city that no longer existed. The transcripts ran to thousands of pages. The collection settled at 215 named transcripts in the archive of the Institute of History of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Then it sat for more than 50 years. The Minsk Commission transcripts were not destroyed. They were not censored. They were institutionally inconvenient. Too granular for the official mythology being constructed in the Soviet 1950s, too Soviet for serious Western scholarship in the same decade, too peripheral to the strategic narrative that Manstein's memoir was constructing in West German publishing. They were filed. They were catalogued. They were available in principle to a researcher who knew to ask. The same was true of the operational archive at Samo in Podolsk. The same was true of the Krasnogorsk POW interrogation files, which contained the recorded statements of every captured 6th Army field officer, including Paulus. The same was true of the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv at Freiburg, where the 6th Army Kriegstagebuch and the Luftflotte 4 logistics records had been held since the 1950s in the captured document collections. The proof already existed. In 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Samo and RGVA collections began to open to Western researchers. Anthony Beevor's Stalingrad, published in 1998, was the first English-language operational history to draw substantially on those files. In 2015, the historian Jochen Hellbeck published Stalingrad, the city that defeated the Third Reich, drawing on the Minsk transcripts that had finally been edited and partially translated. Both works produced a battle that was not new. It was the same battle. The granular reality had always been in the archive. What had changed was access, and through access, delivery. Of the 91,000 Axis prisoners taken on February 2, 1943, the last 6,000 returnees came home in 1955, most from Krasnogorsk, where Paulus himself had been held until 1953 before being released to the German Democratic Republic. He died in Dresden in 1957. The Rososhka German War Cemetery in the steppe west of Volgograd was opened in 1999 with named graves where named graves could be assigned. The Pavlov's house plaque on 9 January Square, now Lenin Square, was placed in the 1960s and lists the names of the defenders. The grain elevator on the southern edge of the city, the structure inside which the 35th Guards Rifle Division and elements of the 92nd Naval Infantry Brigade fought from September 17th to September 22nd, 1942, still stands. Its concrete is pockmarked. Visitors walk past it without knowing what unit died inside it on which day in October 1942. The grain elevator is still there. The Volga still moves past it. Inside the Institute of History archive in Moscow, the Minsk transcripts sit on the shelf where they were placed in 1943, waiting for a reader. One of those transcripts records the testimony of a 62nd Army soldier interviewed in the early months of 1943, a survivor of the elevator fight, who described the position the way a man describes a room he can still see when he closes his eyes, the staircase, the grain dust, the sound of the German half-tracks at the wall. His statement entered the archive in 1943. It was first read by a Western scholar more than half a century later. The historical record has not changed. The documents are still in the archive. The order Hitler signed at Vinica on the night of November 22, 1942, is still in Bundesarchiv file RH 20-6, 16 pages, fully readable exactly as it was signed. The Minsk Commission transcripts are still on the shelf. The 62nd Army War Diary is still at RGVA. The grain elevator is still there. The truth of what happened on a specific date in a specific place to specific human beings is still there, fully documented, fully retrievable, fully unedited. The textbook recorded a sentence. The archive recorded what happened. This content is for educational and historical reflection purposes only. For academic citation, please consult the primary archival sources referenced.